rich, winning the lottery was build a mobile application, right? Step number 2, ... Step number 3, profit, become rich. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case for consumer apps, at least. So that's why we focus on more business apps at my company, TripLingo. We build a single app, but it's more a business app than a consumer app, which is what it started out as. But what we're going to talk about in this session is we're going to talk about Android, iOS. We're going to talk about a couple of different types of ways to build applications. We're going to cover everything, not everything in detail, but we'll touch on native applications, building apps using something like Phonegap, which are web browser wrappers, and then what I like to call app dev platforms like Xamarin and Titanium. And before we get started, I'd just like to take a quick survey. How many people are building apps for iOS? Okay. How many people are building apps for Android? And are you guys building apps? How many people are building apps using, native methods, Objective-C or Android Java? All right. Is anybody using something besides native right now? Phonegap? Anyone using Phonegap? Titanium? Xamarin? No? Okay, so everyone is building apps using native techniques. Is that right? Okay, good. So we're going to talk about how native techniques versus web browser wrappers versus app dev platforms measure up in this session. And we'll do some demos. If you have any questions while we're going through this session, please feel free to ask them at any time. Okay? And obviously we'll focus on iOS and Android because most people care about writing apps for iOS and Android, not so much for other platforms. Is there anyone interested in building apps for Windows Phone, for example? Windows Phone, 1, 2, 3 people. Okay. How about for BlackBerry? Yeah, is BlackBerry dead yet? I think they are, right? So anyways. In my experience, what we did is the startup company that I'm co-founder of, we came out of a startup weekend. You guys are probably familiar with what Startup Weekend is, but essentially we wrote the first version of our product over the course of a weekend in about 50 hours. And we used one of the tools that I talk about here in this session. But after that Startup Weekend, we felt like we really had something that we could make into a commercial product. So I started looking around to see what would be the best way, because a hackathon is a great way to build a prototype, but it's not a great way to build a real product, right? Or building something in 50 hours. So I had to look to see what options there were to build a really nice application that was cross-platform for both iOS and Android, because we always knew from the beginning that we would want to do both. And essentially what I've done is I've taken the research that I did and the experimentation I did at that point in time, kept up with all the other things that have been happening in this space, and have distilled it into this session for you. Okay? So let's do a quick overview of the options, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper. If you're building native mobile, this is pretty straightforward, right? You have to know Objective-C, you need to know Xcode on the iOS side. If you're building Android, you have to know Android Java, you have to know the nuances of running the Dalvik VM, et cetera, et cetera. Right? This is pretty straightforward in terms of native. Right? You have to know the native toolchain for each platform, so that means you have to be familiar with Xcode, you have to know the Android SDK, maybe you might be using Android Studio to build your applications. So you have to know the native toolchain, obviously, if you're building a native application. All right? On Android, if you're still using the Eclipse plugin, using Android Studio, that's the tool you use. For iOS, you use Xcode, right? For better or worse, Xcode is not my favorite programming IDE. That's probably an understatement, but anyways, I'm not here to whine about that. I'm here to tell you what the options are. So with native, you generally have the ability to create the best possible app. But native application development is obviously not cross-platform. You can't take your Objective-C code and run it on Android. Similarly, you can't take your Android Java code and run it on an iOS device. It is not cross-platform at all, right? So the next major kind of area we want to talk about is stuff that's dominated by Phonegap, right? So Phonegap can also include stuff like WorkLight, right? Did anyone go to the WorkLight session that was earlier today? No? Okay, a few people. All right. So WorkLight is essentially Phonegap. Phonegap is a native wrapper around a web browser. That's essentially what it does. Right? What it does is it's a native project for iOS and Android, and that native project has code that initializes a web view widget and makes that the primary view for that native application. But all your code is running, the code that you write is running as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And because it's running as a native app, Phonegap, even though everything is running in a web browser, all the code that you write as a developer is running in a web browser, because it is a native app, what the Phonegap people do is into the JavaScript runtime that's in the web browser that you're coding on in Phonegap, they write hooks into the native layer to access the accelerometer or to hit the contacts, things like that. Right? We'll do a deeper dive into this in a few minutes. But this is kind of what it looks like. You have iPhone OS, and that could very easily just say Android. You have the Phonegap framework. You have Mobile Safari, which is the built-in WebView browser component. And then that WebView browser component is basically a WebKit-based web browser. You have the Phonegap JS, and then you have your application CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. Okay? Now, with Phonegap, you still have to have the native toolchain to be able to build and test the application, because it is essentially a native wrapper. So you still have to have Xcode. You still have to have the Android SDK installed to be able to build a binary that you can run on the emulator or simulator or onto a device. Okay? Now, in terms of the cross-platform story, Phonegap has the best cross-platform story in terms of the sheer number of different devices Phonegap supports. It supports iOS, Android, Symbian, Windows Phone, BlackBerry, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Nobody really cares about anything about iOS and Android, right? Does anyone care about any of the platforms besides iOS and Android today? Probably not. Right? Maybe Firefox Os. Have they released Firefox Os phones in India yet? No, they haven't. I think that's coming later this year. But Firefox OS, in case you haven't heard of it, is basically it's a mobile operating system that is going to run on very low-cost hardware. So instead of having, and I apologize, I have to use U.S. dollars. I don't know how much stuff costs in India. But like if you try to go out and get a budget Android phone, in the U.S. it typically ranges in the $150 to $200 range, right, for a budget Android device. If you try to go get a Samsung Galaxy S4 or S5, it usually costs in the $500 to $600 range, right? That's a premium Android phone. Firefox OS is going to come out with a $25 smartphone. Okay, their target is reaching folks who use feature phones and not smartphones. But anyway, we can talk about that later. So in terms of Phonegap, what you do is you code your application right in the desktop browser for most of your application, right? So because you're just writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript most of the time, you may hook into native components, but when you just need to build your app out, the UI, a little bit of business logic, you can actually write a lot of that stuff directly in a desktop browser and then just drag it into or copy it into your Phonegap project and then deploy it on the device for testing. And in terms of what people generally tend to use to build Phonegap applications, people don't generally tend to write all the CSS and JavaScript and HTML by hand. Typically, people will use a library that's meant for the mobile web, like jQuery Mobile, SensuTouch, or Kendo UI. Right? All three of these are popular libraries, or I should say, UI libraries, components, for building applications for the mobile web, but they can also be used in Phonegap because essentially you are building a single-page web application that's freestanding. Right? So it doesn't contact a server, but it's a single-page web app that is standalone that you can essentially just run by pulling up the index.html or whatever into a web browser, in this case, into a Phonegap-based web browser. So again, this is what it looks like. You have your operating system, whether it's iOS or Android. You have your Phonegap native wrapper application. That's what Phonegap is. It's a native wrapper around a WebKit browser engine, and your code runs inside the web browser. Okay? So Phonegap, this is a oversimplification, but Phonegap is essentially just a wrapper around a web view, a native wrapper around a web view. Right? All your code runs in a web browser. So what we're going to do quickly is we're going to do a quick demo of Phonegap. And again, if you have questions while we're doing this, please raise your hand or shout it out. So first things first, with Phonegap, what you do is you have to use npm, and let's make sure this is installed. Actually, I'm not going to try to install it. What you do is you have to install Node, and you have to install npm, which comes with the Node, to be able to get started with it. This is how you would do it. Obviously, you need to have Node installed first. I think they may even have a freestanding build that you can use, but typically the way people build with Phonegap is you do npm install Phonegap, and once you have that, you can just do Phonegap create my app. And that will create a template app for you. Right? I'm not going to run that because I already have one created, and this is what it looks like. Right? And within this folder, you'll have a platforms folder for the different types of platforms you've run your Phonegap app on. So I already have a pre-created Phonegap app, like I was showing you. This is what it looks like. And here's my www folder. If I do an ls on that, you'll see that what I have in here is I have an index.html. That's my bootstrap point. So when Phonegap starts up, it looks in the www folder. That's where we're at right now. And it looks for an index.html, and that is basically the bootstrap point for your single-page web application running in Phonegap. Okay? But you can also see I have app.js. I have Cordova, which is the Phonegap library, JavaScript library that comes packaged with it, and there's some CSS, et cetera, right? It's a web application. That's all it is, right? So what I do now is I can, from the command line, I can just do Phonegap run iOS, and the Phonegap command line utility will fire up, and you can see there it says I told it to run on iOS, so it's compiling some iOS stuff. It's going to install the app onto the emulator, and in a second, it should pop open the app. There it goes. It just popped open in the background. Okay? So this is a simple dictionary-type application I call Spice Guide that I wrote. And I'll show you the code for this in just a second. But you can see as I click on something, right, I'll click on aniseed. Maybe not. Well, that's great. It's not working today. Let's see if this about button works. Yep. So anyways, you get the idea. The app itself is not important, but it's how we put this together that's important to us. Oh, there it goes. I don't know why it didn't work the first time. All right, so there's the definition of aniseed. But this is a simple application I put together that kind of resembles a dictionary, right, or a glossary of something. Okay? Let's see if this works. I don't remember how all this stuff works now. I just put this together very quickly. So let's go have a look at this, really, and see what... Let's go open this actually directly in Xcode. Right? So what I'm going to do, this is an iOS project. So one of the things Phonegap does for you is that it creates, again, this wrapper native shell project. It's taking a web browser for that specific platform. In this case, this is iOS. So what it's doing underneath the hood is it's doing a new UI WebView. UI WebView is part of the Cocoa Touch SDK for iOS. Takes that and makes it the main view in your application, right? And along with that, it has to generate a native project. So when I looked in this folder, platforms, iOS, right here, you can see that there's a hello world.xcode project. So this is basically an Xcode project. And as you saw just a second ago, I actually opened the project directly in Xcode, right? So let's have a look and see what all we have in here. We'll get to the HTML in just a second. But if I go into the classes folder, you can see it's generated a main view that is bootstrapping the, actually it would be in the nib. It's bootstrapping a UI web view somewhere in here. Right? Unfortunately, I can't show you the code for the nib. But this is the basic stuff here. And if we go into some of the utility classes, we will eventually, I don't remember exactly where it is now. Here it is. You can see that as part of this, we have a couple of things that are included. And there's my libcordova. So Cordova is the name of Phonegap. What happened a few years ago is the company that was building Phonegap was bought by Adobe, and Phonegap has always been open source, but what they did is they formalized the open source nature of it by taking Phonegap, giving it to the Apache Foundation, right? Everyone has heard of the Apache Foundation. They have a bunch of open source projects up, and they, for some reason, they renamed it from Phonegap to Cordova. Anyways, so when I say Phonegap or when I say Cordova, I'm referring to the same thing. Okay, but if you look here, you can see I have my libcordova. This is the native wrapper stuff that is needed by Phonegap to be able to provide the functionality that I was referring to earlier, accessing the accelerometer, or getting a hold of the contacts, or the Bluetooth, or the gyroscope, or whatever it may be. Okay, so but it's just included as a library, and that's how Phonegap accesses those things underneath the hood. So let's go look at our W folder, i.e. our application. So let me open up this index.html. And of course, that is not readable because this is Xcode, which makes everything difficult to customize. But if we look at this, you can see it's just an HTML file up here at the top. All right, here's my title, and then I'm importing some stuff. So you can see, for example, importing. Actually, this one is using jQuery, which was a predecessor to jQuery Mobile. Okay, but you can see one of the things I'm doing here is I have this theme. It's an Apple-based theme that I'm using specifically. This has nothing to do with Phonegap, by the way. Phonegap is essentially out of the picture at this point. This is jQuery. So if you use Kendo UI, or you use jQuery Mobile, or you use SensuTouch, right, that would, at this point, we would be talking about code for those specific web frameworks. In this case, I'm using jQuery, but just to show you, I can go into this file, and let me see if I can remember how to switch the theme. All right, so the theme is in themes/Apple. So let's open up themes, and there's another theme called JQT. So let's switch the theme really quickly. All right. And so I'll switch the theme from this Apple theme. So if you watch this really closely in just a second, what will happen, and again, Phonegap is a native wrapper around a web view. And I've opened that native wrapper in that specific native platform's build tool, in this case Xcode, so I can actually go and directly run this application from Xcode now. Okay? So hopefully this is running now. Let's go switch back. And it looks like it's taking some time. Okay, there it goes. And let's change the zoom. All right, so I'm just running in a different simulator, but you can see the theme has changed now, because I went into the HTML and said, instead of using something that mimics Apple's iOS style, let's use this other theme called jQuery. And remember, what I did was I just switched out the theme. So if I change this back to Apple and then go and relaunch this, you'll see that the theme will change. Yes, stop it. In just a second, right? Right. So, but the point here is that all I have is some HTML. I have JavaScript. I have CSS. Right? If we go look at some of the files that are here, you can see here's my main app.js that I import in my index.html somewhere. Just trying to remember where I import that. It's here somewhere. I don't remember where. Right. There's where I'm importing my app.js. So then if I go into my app.js, I have a bunch of different things in here I do to be able to construct or build a functionality for showing the dictionary, right? So again, what we were doing in our little dictionary app is when I click this button, it creates this table of stuff, and when I click that, it opens a new thing. And at this point, again, Phonegap is kind of out of the way. We're just building a single-page web application. So what I could actually do here, right? So if I go back to my thing here, I can open my www folder. I'll open up Safari. All right, and this is desktop Safari now. And I can literally take this index.html, open it in Safari, and look, it's just a web application. It's a freestanding web application. Right? So you can see some of the animations even work. Okay? The other thing I could do, obviously, is I could go into mobile Safari here. I could take this index.html, drag it into there, and boom. Again, it's just a web app. Single page web application, freestanding, not served from the server, but served from local files. Okay? So if I pull down on this, you can see here's the Chrome. If I go back to the actual application, i.e. the Phonegap wrapped application, you can see when I pull down, there's no Chrome at the top or at the bottom. Okay? Because this is essentially taking a UI web view, making it full screen as part of the application, and of course you're not going to have the standard web browser buttons anymore because it's not a web browser, it's just a web view. All right? So I could give you more of a tour of like how this app works and stuff, but again, it's just a web app. It could be anything. Right? So is there any questions about this before I move on? Hopefully this is pretty straightforward. Phonegap is the easiest of these to usually explain. Yes, sir? Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead. ADF, yeah. Okay. Is it a web-based thing as well? Right, okay. Right, so I mentioned IBM WorkLight earlier. That's also very similar to Phonegap. I think it actually, WorkLight uses Phonegap underneath the hood as part of its infrastructure. Oh, so Oracle ADF also uses Phonegap/Cordova. Okay, I didn't know that. So I try to stay as far away from Oracle as possible. Hope this isn't being recorded. Yes, go ahead.
If I understand you, the basic app that you made was pure HTML. So how do you get the reference, the list of the characters?
You're talking about. So the question is how do I get a list of with these things?
No, the A to Z on the right-hand side.
Oh, yeah. It's just a div. Let me show it to you real quick. It's just a div. You obviously know what a div is, right? Yeah. Okay. Wrong editor. Let's go into here, and let me see. Damn it, that one. What did I call this? Nope, in the wrong file. Let's go into here. I think I may be constructing that in JavaScript, actually. Oh, I called it a floaty. There it is. There's my floaty. That's my functions for toggling it and hiding it and stuff. There it is. Right, so the.
So you have really constructed it doesn't come natively with that view.
I'm sorry?
You have really constructed in your app, it doesn't come native.
Yeah, it's not native. It's not native. This is all in the web browser. There's no native component here except for the web view itself. And you can see, you can't see because the font is too damn small in Xcode. But if I zoom in, you'll see that it's just a div, right? And you can see I have an unordered list, and I just applied some styling around it to make it mimic what you would normally have in an iOS application. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? That's a good question. Yes. Okay, so the question, the comment is we tried to use Phonegap and we found a lot of limitations, right? Okay, I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a bit. Okay? Any more questions on Phonegap before we move on? No? Okay, great. So the next broad category that I would like to talk about is what I call app dev platforms. And actually, I think one of the sponsors are they on? Yeah, Xamarin. So Xamarin is actually one of the sponsors at GIDS this year, right? And what app dev platforms do is they take a different approach. They don't run stuff in a web browser. Almost all these app dev platforms do things in the same general style, right? But they do it in different ways. So at a high level, they're very much similar, but at the implementation, it's very different. So for example, Xamarin used to be called Monotouch. You write code in C#, all right? And then you also have Ansgar Corona, which is very popular in the game community, it uses Lua as the programming language. Lua is a scripting language for C and C++ if you've never used it. All right? And then the most popular out of these app dev platforms is something called Appcelerator Titanium, and with that you write JavaScript. And I'll talk more about Appcelerator Titanium, and we'll actually do a demo of that in a few minutes. But even though it's using JavaScript, there's no web browser in Appcelerator Titanium. It just uses JavaScript as a language to build on top of their platform. So just like in Xamarin, we're using C#, but again, C# is just the language that they chose to use that you as a developer use to build on top of their platform. Okay? We'll get into that in just a minute. So, and what the app dev platforms do, and the first bullet point, there should be an asterisk next to it, which is that some of them generate some code. If you're using Xamarin, for example, it does embed a C# runtime inside of your mobile application, but it also generates some code. It actually will generate like views and other things like that from your C# code. It will generate Objective-C and will generate a little bit of Java code. But again, we don't want to get too far into the nuances on this because we're not here to specifically talk about Xamarin, but understand how these app dev platforms work and what they do. Typically what they do is they don't generate code, or they may generate a little bit of code, but it's essentially these app dev platforms, if you had to quantify it in one sentence, it would be that these app dev platforms are essentially just bridges. They're bridge layers. What they do is they bridge C# down to iOS and C# down into Objective-C. Similarly for Titanium, it bridges a JavaScript runtime where you write JavaScript code, and it does a bridge into Objective-C and a bridge into Java. Okay? So, and you still have to use the native toolchain because at the end of the day, out of any of the options we talk about, you eventually have to produce a binary, an IPA file for iOS, or an APK file for Android. You have to produce that binary so that it can be installed on the emulator or installed onto a device. So you still need the native toolchain, regardless. And the way this bridge layer works, for example, if we think of Titanium, right, is that there's a JavaScript runtime running in your Titanium app. And what the Accelerator Titanium developers do is they write native Objective-C and native Java code that plugs into that JavaScript runtime and kind of glues together API calls beneath into the JavaScript runtime. Right? It's a classic bridge. So what the bridge does is it's marshalling and unmarshalling method invocations and creating classes and sending data back and forth from the JavaScript or C# runtime, if we're talking about Xamarin, down into the native layer. So it's basically you have a call that goes down, does something in native code, and then it returns back. Right? And hopefully that will become clear in a few minutes once we actually look at an example. So again, this is how it works. And the font is a little small, so I'll zoom in a bit. What you do, for example, in Titanium, is you do titanium.ui.createWindow. That is a specific Titanium API call. It's non-standard. And I'm saying, in this case, I'm saying for this window, create a title of Spice Guide, hide the nav bar, don't hide the nav bar, but do hide the tab bar. Right? I can also set a background image and a color and dimensions and all the standard stuff that a window object in iOS or a window object in Android would take when you configure it, or the parameters that you would use to initialize it. All right? So you write your code up there. The app platform, again, this is a runtime. If you're Accelerator Titanium, it is a JavaScript runtime. If you're using Xamarin, it's a C# runtime. And what they do is that vendor writes this little line is the code that they write that plugs into that runtime. So they'll write native Objective-C code to plug into iOS and native Android code to plug into that C# or JavaScript or whatever runtime. And you write your code in C# or JavaScript on top, and it gets essentially translated or bridged down into the native layer. Okay? So let's do a deep dive of Titanium. And as I'm going through this, if you have any questions or you want to try something, we can do it. So Titanium is open source and it's 100% free. You can actually go to GitHub. It's licensed under APL, the Apache Public License, so it's a business-friendly license. But you can go to GitHub and you can actually download the entire SDK if you want and build it on your desktop. Okay? They do also have a nice IDE called Titanium Studio, which is based on Eclipse. When I'm working through the demo in just a second, that's what I'll be working in. Okay? Right, so Titanium, again, is you code in JavaScript, and it is not a generator. When you write that JavaScript code, it is not generating Objective-C. It is not generating Java code. Again, it's a bridge layer. It makes a direct method invocation or class instantiation down into the native layer and returns a handle to that class that you've instantiated down here up into the JavaScript runtime so that you can do stuff with it. And you'll see what I mean in just a second by what do stuff is. So in terms of code reuse, for us and for other people in the Titanium community, we write our app using Titanium. And so do a lot of other people. They claim to have over 500,000 developers as part of their platform, right? I don't know if that means active developers or registered developers or whatever, but they're probably the largest out of the different app dev platforms. What we see in our own application is that 100% of the code that is not specifically for the user interface is portable between iOS and Android without a single change. So you might be saying, well, what non-UI code are you talking about? Making a HTTP request to log the user in, do authorization. Authentication. Okay? Once the user's logged in, we get a big bundle of JSON data. That's the user's profile. We bring that into the application. We parse it, store it away, blah, blah, blah. Right? That's non-UI code. The other thing we do is we bundle foreign language data within the application as a SQLite database. SQLite is an embedded database engine. So we have a ton of calls in our code base that make a SQL query and then iterate over the results and then go and update view elements and stuff. All that stuff is 100% portable. Okay? So basically, anything that's non-UI between iOS and Android, 100% portable without any changes whatsoever, which is great. That in and of itself is a win right there. All our business logic, handling user profiles, calculating the user's language learning metrics, i.e. their scores and their badges and stuff like that, all that stuff 100% portable. What we found in the latest iteration of our application after a refactor is we see approximately 80 to 90% code reuse for UI elements now. A lot of that has to do with us and not with Titanium. We understand iOS really well. We understand Android really well, right? Like today, or this week I should say, I'm carrying around my Nexus 4. Last week I was carrying around my iPhone 4S, right? So I switch it up because we build for both platforms. So as a developer who's building for iOS and Android, I actually use both phones. I'll switch it up every couple of weeks. I'll use my Android device for a couple of weeks, and then I'll use my iOS device for a couple of weeks because I'm building on those platforms. I need to know it really well, right? So anyways, my point here is that once you know the platforms really well and you're able to mentally abstract things away in your code base, you get much better reuse of the UI code between the two platforms. Okay? So it's not one of those things where you're like, oh, I'm just going to start using Titanium and it'll all be great and I'll be able to build awesome apps for both iOS and Android. But if you don't know iOS really well or if you don't know Android really well, how can you be successful at building something really nice for those platforms, right? All right, so that's what the last bullet point is. Once you get more experience with the platforms, right, iOS and Android, once you understand how Titanium abstracts those platforms in its API, you get much better code reuse and you avoid pitfalls and nuances, right? So again, Titanium is native. When you make a Titanium API call, you're creating a native object, right? You're invoking a native method. No code generation. You're working with native widgets. This is starkly different than Phonegap, where the demo I just showed you a couple of minutes ago, which looked like an iOS 6 style application, that was actually a web app with a specific library that had CSS and other things to mimic an iPhone 6 experience, right? I could literally take that same Phonegap app, fire it up in Android, and I'm running something that looks like an iOS app on an Android device, right? It obviously doesn't feel right. But with Titanium, when I create, for example, a button using Titanium, and we'll do this in just a second, using titanium.ui.createButton, on iOS, it's using a native iOS button, UI button. On Android, it's using a native com.android.ui.button, and it actually looks like it's supposed to look on that operating system because it's a native widget. All right? So let's do some live coding. And again, as I'm going through this, if you have any questions, you can try some things. All right, so let me get some plumbing up really quickly. And I'll explain the plumbing in a few minutes. But let's get this going first. All right? So let's get our little, and that is way too big. All right, let's scale this down to 75. Let's make it a little smaller. All right, scale it down to 50%. All right, and I'm going to open up Titanium Studio here really quickly, and I'm going to try to make this all fit in this really small screen. All right. I'll explain some of the other stuff that's going around here, going through here first. But let's actually let's code some widgets up and do something, and then I'll explain in a few minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of the snippets that are built into Titanium Studio, so I don't have to type all this out for you in the demo. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call create label, and we'll call this hello label. Right? And let's set the text color for our hello label right now to be white. And we'll set the font size to be something large, 36, not 46, 36. And I'm just going to let the operating system compute the height and width. But I do want to use absolute positioning and place it 100 pixels from the top. And now that I have this hello label, I need to fix it to a view so it can be seen, right? I already have a view in this specific example called self, which is just it's just a standard view. Again, I'll explain some of the subtlety that's going on underneath with this. But you can see here's my hello label. Okay? And why is that not aligned to the middle? I said text align. Huh, weird. Okay. That's all right. We can fix that up later. Okay, so anyways, there you see. I created a hello label, and let's change this hello label instead of saying this stupid thing to say hello kids. Right? So let's save that. And of course, that didn't work for some reason. Oh, it did work. Sorry. All right. So I've created a basic label. Let's create another view element. Let's go to, again, I'm going to use the snippets to make this go a little faster. And let's call this button change button. And you can see that if you notice from this, you can see I did titanium.ui.create label. TI is just shorthand for titanium, just alias. ti.ui.create button. I give it a title. Let's call this change something. Okay? And I'm going to get rid of the height and width for now. I'll let the operating system compute that. And instead of having it absolutely positioned from the top, let's put it 100 pixels from the bottom. And I'll get rid of the left so it just centers it. Oh, that's not going to work. I forgot to do one thing, which is I need to add the change button to a view so it's shown. So, and you can see that this is weird. Oh, I know what's going on here. I think I forgot to reset this. Absolute. There we go. All right. So you can see that here's my change button. Now, if I go into here, as part of the snippet, it's generated an event listener. So I have change button, add event listener. When it's clicked, pop open an alert that says the change button was clicked. So if I come over here and click this, you'll see I get an alert. And you can see so far these are all, if you use iOS, you'll recognize everything as basically a native widget. Right? And for some reason in iOS, I'm not sure why, but they made the buttons look like labels. I thought that was the dumbest thing ever. But which one is a label on this screen? Can you tell? No, of course not. Right? For some reason, the design geniuses at Apple thought that it would be a good idea to make buttons look exactly like labels. I don't know what they're thinking over there. But anyways. All right, so we can do other things too. So let's we have this hello label here. And again, what's happening when I do ti.ui.create label is that it's reaching down into the native layer. It's actually doing new UI label with the properties that I pass it. And it returns me a reference to that so that I could change it or add an event listener or whatever. So what I can do here is I can take this hello label and I can do add event listener. And we'll say instead of just looking for a boring click event, let's listen for a swipe event. This is what you should do. This is a callback function that you should invoke. when when the user does a swipe event on the hello label, and we'll say hello label.text equals, I don't know, stop swiping me or something. Right? So let's save that, send that in, and you'll see that as I drag this from left to right, i.e. simulate a swipe, you'll see that it changed the text of the label. Okay? All right, so let me stop here and take some questions. I've done some basic UI. I've shown how to use the API to create native widgets. We've done a little bit of advanced stuff. So let me stop here and take some questions. Is there any questions so far or anything we want to try? Does all make sense? This is Titanium Studio, right? So the folks at Accelerator, the people who make Titanium, they provide this IDE called Titanium Studio. It's a fully integrated development environment. It's actually based on Eclipse, but it's not an Eclipse plugin. Okay? No. So the question was, is the iOS simulator part of this? No, I already have Xcode installed, and I have the iOS SDK installed. So you have to have all that stuff. It doesn't matter what option you use. If you're doing Phonegap, native obviously, or Titanium or Xamarin, anything you use to build an iOS application, you have to have iOS SDK and the Xcode and all that stuff installed. Okay? How is this what? Yes. I'm using some fancy plumbing to do that. So normally, if I were writing this, so let's go change something really quickly, right? When you first come to Titanium, let's change this from green to, I don't know, let's call it, let's change it from, damn it, I didn't want to do that. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kill the simulator. And what you would do in Titanium Studio is you go to the top left, and you can see there's a little run button here. So you can also debug or package your application. Packaging obviously means getting it ready to install onto the device or upload to the App Store. And let's say we want to run this on the iPhone. Let me zoom out a little bit. All right, let's run this on the iPhone Retina. And if I can do this quickly enough, we will see, if we go to the console, this is the messages you can see that Titanium is doing. But you can see as part of this, you can see initiating Xcode precompile phase. And then down here, we already did an Xcode build, so it's not rebuilding the whole app from scratch. If we were to go delete the build folder, you would see a bunch of Xcode messages where it's actually building a binary. But you can see it's installing it on the simulator, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Does that answer your question? Okay. More questions? Yes, sir.
How easy or hard control the layout on different platforms? Just a simple app.
Yeah. Okay. So the question was how do you work with the layout, right? Especially on different platforms. Well, let's go change this. Let me actually relaunch this right here. Right. So instead of just using absolute positioning, which can be useful sometimes, we use a combination of horizontal, vertical positioning, and a couple of other commonly known techniques. So let's switch this. Let's see if this pops open. Right, from absolute to horizontal positioning. So I'll get rid of my tops and bottoms now because we don't want that when we do horizontal positioning. So let's save that. Now you'll see they're next to each other. I can also make this vertical positioning so they get stacked. Right? So what we do is we use a combination of view containers that have certain widgets in them. We add that view container with those widgets to a larger view widget, and then that will go onto a window, for example. Right? And there's this is not something that's specific to Titanium. There are certain techniques that are reasonably well known for doing flexible user interface layouts. Okay, I don't have time to go into those techniques right now, but there's common. You'll find stuff if you Google it on how people deal with the different iPhone and iPad resolutions. Then, of course, the bane of every the bane of every app developer's existence is Android, because Android comes in different aspect ratios, different dot pixels, different resolutions, and it just, we spend more time trying to make stuff look right on Android than anything else, actually. Okay? All right. Yes, sir, go ahead. Can I what? Oh, no, there's no web browser here. So the CSS doesn't even make sense here. You saw how I coded this, right? I did titanium.ui.createLabel. I made a direct JavaScript call down into the native layer. So what that titanium.ui.createLabel does is it reaches down into the native layer, and in the Cocoa Touch iOS native SDK does new UI label parameters. There's no CSS, there's no web browser here at all. We're working with native widgets. The JavaScript, in this case, is just a bridge down into the native Objective-C SDK runtime. Okay? Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Yes. Okay, so the comment is how do you maintain uniformity of your look and feel, right? So there are several different ways you can do that. We're coding in JavaScript here, so we could create a style object that we just pass in as the parameter and do a mix-in, right? So we could set a default color, background, font, set it as an object literal in JavaScript, and then whenever we initialize any kind of widget, we say, these are the defaults for it, okay? So that's one way you can do it. There are lots of, you're just coding JavaScript at this point. So there are lots of well-known techniques for being able to apply a common set of properties to whatever you want, different widgets, okay? But saying that, this is a common problem that a lot of Titanium developers have faced over the years. So the Titanium actually have a MVC framework called Titanium Alloy, where they have, it's not CSS, but it's basically, they have a place where you can define what the style for everything in your application looks like in a very specific format, and it will just get applied to all your widgets in your application. But that specific thing is called Titanium Alloy, right? It's basically, it's a framework that sits on top of Titanium. Okay? What I've been demoing here so far is what they call Titanium Classic, which is what Titanium has always been up until recently. I think Alloy came out about 2 years ago. Titanium itself has been around for about 5-6 years now. Okay? Yes, sir? Yes. So the question is with Titanium, can I use native features? Absolutely, because there's a bridge layer that allows you to access anything in the native layer, pretty much. Right? If the Titanium API doesn't support something that's in the native layer, what you do is you write a Titanium module that basically glues that thing into Titanium. But out of the box, for example, you can access the accelerometer. You can access the contacts. You can access the magnometer, the compass. On Android, you can access background services. On Android, you can do intents. On Android, you can also avail of the action bar. Okay? All those different things that you want to do. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, so the follow-up question was, some stuff like background services only works on Android. There's no such thing on iOS. Well, yeah. You can't run that on iOS. You have to do something different for iOS. And remember, there was a statistic I showed earlier in terms of we get approximately 80% code reuse between the two platforms, right? A lot of that 20% that's not the same is for accommodating for nuances between the two platforms. A perfect example of that is, if you're familiar with Android, there's a menu and back button on Android, which you don't have on iOS, right? So what we do on iOS, because we want the user to have a native experience for that application, for our application on that platform. So on Android, we have a block of code that only runs on Android, hooks into the back end menu button. Similarly, on iOS, when we do a table view, and we have table view rows in them, there are specific iOS table view row stylings that we use, and we have a little switch statement, if block, that says if we're running on iOS, use this table view row styling that is only available on iOS, right? So that's one of the great things about Titanium and Xamarin, actually, is that it's not a lowest common denominator kind of thing. You can do stuff that's only available on a specific platform to create the best possible experience for your user for that platform. So an action bar is another great example, right? There's no action bar on iOS, But we, if we wanted to, we could use that on Android. Obviously, we do something different on iOS. So we say, if it's Android, use the action bar. If not, do this other thing for iOS. Okay? Yes, ma'am. Yes, it's a bridge to the native layer. Okay, so the question is there any way that, because I'm accessing the native layer, is there any way that I can restrict that access? I think that's the wrong question to ask, actually, right? Because you're building the application as a developer. All the JavaScript is bundled in the application. It's not like somebody can hack into the application unless by using JavaScript injection or something, right? Yeah. Okay. I think I understand your question. So say you also have sensitive data in your application. You can encrypt the data that's in your application using a number of different techniques. There's actually a module that allows you to have a data store within your Titanium app that uses an encrypted data store. Okay? So there's lots of different things you can do to accommodate for that. But generally speaking, you have the app has access to everything on the phone that the phone will allow it to. So on Android, for example, different apps can't access each other's files. Same thing for iOS. App A cannot access the files of App B. It's just not allowed in the operating system level. Okay? All right. So let me move on. I only have a few minutes. I do want to do a comparison really quickly. All right. So I'm going to go past some of the other stuff I have here. I'm not going to talk about the native toolchain. Basically, it doesn't matter how you build your application. You need to get a certain level of familiarity with the native toolchain. Okay? I'm going to skip over those slides, but let's compare the options. Right? Native, you get no code reuse. You have the possibility of building the best possible application. It's great for games and low-level needs. The cost, obviously, is very high because there's no ability to do cross-platform. Okay? And when I say it's the best possible experience, a lot of this, we're all software developers. A lot of how we build projects is based on resources, money and time, right? Just because you can build the best possible app using native doesn't mean it's necessarily the right answer because it takes a lot of money to build an app twice. It takes a lot of time to build an app twice, right? So you can do the best possible experience, but what's good enough? So Phonegap, using the technology you know and love, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you get fairly rapid experience. Some of the drawbacks is the user experience is hard to perfect because you're basically building in a web browser, the UI. The other thing is the performance is not very good. Okay, performance can be problematic on Phonegap, especially if you're not a HTML, CSS, and JavaScript guru. If you're not, you may think you're a guru, but if you know that, for example, that parts of a component cache on a web browser are sometimes spooled off when it fills up and how the swapping happens, if you understand that kind of stuff, then yes, this may be the right thing for you. But you also have the nuances of the different browsers in there that make it difficult to really build a nice Phonegap application. So Phonegap apps work, in my opinion, work really well for simple to moderately complex applications, i.e. they work really well for business applications, right? But again, simple to moderately complex. In app dev platforms, you get great code reuse. The performance is very close to native. We see 90 to 95% of native performance using Titanium, which is great, right? Phonegap is way less than that. I'll show you a chart in just a second. We get rapid development. So I'm using a very specific tool here called Titanium Shadow or TiShadow, which allows me in a native, again, this is running native, right? I can actually go in and I can make a change to some code and you can see, boom, it shows up on the emulator. Well, guess what else I can do? I can take this same TiShadow application, I can install it onto my Android device, or I should say my 7 different Android test devices, and I can install it onto my iPhone and my iPad, and I can make code. I'll have all the devices laid out in front of me. I'll start writing some code, and it will instantly change across all of them. So it makes the rapid development story with Titanium is amazing because of these community-contributed tools like TiShadow, Titanium Shadow. Okay? Fortunately, I don't have time to talk about that. Okay? like kind of edge cases, how to write performant code, and other things like that in Titanium, right? So it doesn't come for free. You do have to spend some time learning Titanium itself and the nuances of it, all right? So a quick, we'll just have a couple of slides left. What I wanted to show is some graphics in terms of comparing the options. So when we talk about native, you get virtually no code reuse. Phonegap has probably the best code reuse story. Titanium and Xamarin are probably behind it. Titanium specifically. Xamarin actually, in several cases, in a lot of cases, forces you to write code specifically for that platform. So if I had to tell you like where Xamarin fits into the code reuse, I would put it down near 50 or 60% rather than at 80, 90% for Titanium. Okay? So in terms of performance, obviously native runs at 100% performance. If you can get native to run at 110 performance, I'd like to talk to you because you've broken the rules of physics, right? So Phonegap, I put, at my estimation, at around 30% of native performance. Okay, this is why I said performance is bad. Right? And I've heard lots of people, like the lady who was asking about performance in Phonegap because they tried it. I've had a lot of people tell me they started writing a project in Phonegap and eventually they had to abandon it because they just weren't able to get the pixel perfectness, right? A really nice user interface that was smooth, and they were having performance issues. Okay, so Titanium, again, we see close to 90% of native performance with it, which is one of the reasons we like it. All right, and then the learning curve. Obviously, native has the largest learning curve. Phonegap has the lowest learning curve, and Titanium is somewhere in between. Again, nothing comes for free with these app dev platforms. You have to learn that specific platform. Right? An analogy I like to make is, you guys know what JPA or Hibernate is, right? It's an object relational mapper, right? It's basically, ORM is something that abstracts a database. So not only do you need to know SQL and know what databases are, but you have to learn all the little nuances of JPA or Hibernate to be effective at using it. Titanium is no different. It's an abstraction layer on top of an operating system, so you have to learn those two things to be really well to be successful at it. All right. So with that, I am at the end of time. But once we start, basically we're going to finish the session, and then if you would like to stay for questions, I'll be happy to answer questions for as long as you like. Okay? I'm sorry, say again? Yes, okay. So the question was how does Xamarin compare to Titanium in terms of performance? I would say it's roughly in the same neighborhood of 90 to 95%. Okay? Almost all the app dev platforms are in the same ballpark of 80 to 95% of native performance. Yeah. So the question was can you find developers for Xamarin / Titanium? Titanium is much more popular than Xamarin. So it has a bigger developer pool, if you will. Xamarin is a little bit smaller, or it's much smaller because there aren't as many developers of it, right? So, but you can, I know in Bangalore there's probably a dozen different Titanium consulting shops in Bangalore alone. That's just the ones I know of. Okay, in the U.S. and in Western Europe, there are tons of consulting shops, or like my company uses it. There are lots of big companies that use it as well. Okay. For Xamarin, there's no what? Oh, there are, but they're just far fewer of them, right? There are like in Atlanta, I know at least 2 consulting firms that use Xamarin in Atlanta, but I also know about 15 different companies / firms, maybe more, that use Titanium. It's just, Titanium says they have about 500,000 developers. I don't know exactly what Xamarin's numbers are, but I think their number, if I had to guess, would be like in the 75,000 range, right? So it's that, to give you an idea. You can ask the Xamarin guys; they'll probably give you a more accurate. But I know the Titanium folks crossed over 500,000 registered developers about 6 months ago. Okay, yes, sir. So one thing you do is you could use Titanium as a phone. You could make your own Phonegap with Titanium. One of the things I could have done is I could have gone in and do titanium.ui.createWebView. And then I could just bundle some HTML files, And I could do HTML5 development in Titanium if I want. And that's a path that a lot of people take.